Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the 60th session of Majlis Khonji. Please allow me to introduce our guest for this session, Dr. Jarmo Kotilaine, economist and strategist. He studied economics and economic history at Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard universities. Dr. Jarmo is an economist with an interdisciplinary perspective who had devoted most of his career to understanding and enabling economic development in emerging economies. Among all the Arabian Gulf countries, he is an active participant in economic discussion, and he has spoken and written widely in related subjects. From 2012 to 2016, he held the position of Chief Economist at the Bahrain Economic Development Board, EDB, where his work focused on economic policy and strategic issues. Since 2016, he's been providing his experience at Bahrain's Labor Fund, Tamkeen, an organization dedicated to driving inclusive private sector-led developments. Dr. Kotilaine's latest work, Trials on Resilience, How COVID-19 is Driving Economic Change in the Arab Gulf, draws on his inside knowledge of the region to help paint a clear picture of the opportunities facing the Gulf economies and people during historic transition. He worked for a number of years as an economic and financial consultant with a primary focus on emerging markets. Welcome, Dr. Jarmo, to Majlis Khonji. And I would like also to welcome our session moderator, Engineer Amir Youssef, the CEO of Tree Projects Bahrain. Mr. Amir, over to you and our guest. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rehan. صباح الخير جميعا. I'll promise that I'll have a very short introduction, and Dr. Jarmo promised to have a short presentation as well. So we'll have a very controlled session. Everybody will go out or will continue staying home actually. Anyway, my introduction is short. It's simply, I go back to what I discussed repeatedly in the previous sessions, that in the Gulf, over the past 50 years, we have a bit sort of a distorted, system from different perspectives. Government depending mainly on oil as an income, and they continue to have or to spend and sometimes overspend based on certain prices for that. And they created an environment where, distorted in terms, they were offering support and subsidies in different formats. Those subsidies became almost, both businesses and people rely on them 100%. The pay scale of people is based on such actually support that people used to over the years, as well as the businesses, whether directly or indirectly, are benefiting from all these support and subsidies. Few years back, 4 or 5 years back, as we all know, the drop of the oil happened. The government started their fiscal re-engineering, okay, which started actually the impact and will have more impacts over the coming years, both on the people as well as on the businesses. Sadly, COVID-19 came actually, and that worsened the situation from one angle, okay, and from another angle, that might actually help in speeding up the reforms from the different, both in economy, social, and potentially even, political reforms happen. I would guess we are very lucky to have Dr. Jarmo with us. He had his experience in Europe, followed by what is important for us here is his experience in the region. He has been 8 years in Bahrain, and I'm not sure how many years in Saudi, but in Bahrain, I'm more interested in because he had a role, in setting up, whether directly, indirectly, setting up policies, particularly on the macro level when he was the chief economist in the EDB. And now in Tamkeen, which is the labor fund, he is there to propose and set up policies to support the businesses, enterprises, as well as developing the locals, to get work opportunities. So we'll open now the chance for Dr. Jarmo to start his presentation, and then luckily till now the number of attendees is small in my opinion compared to the others, unless they are joining, and we'll have a better chance to have a more fruitful discussions after the presentation. Thank you. Please, Dr. Jarmo.
All right. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Majlis Khonji for inviting me. I very much appreciate the opportunity. It's been too many years since I last had a chance to speak at an event in Oman, but hopefully this will change for the better in the future. This book, which is something that I finished in late November, is obviously cannot be the final word on the subject of COVID-19. I've made my task a little bit easier in the sense that the book is really not primarily about COVID-19. I think it is about a bigger story, and it might be helpful if I explain the background a little bit. So I had been for some time working on a larger project about what I call the economic development journey of the Gulf countries. And just as I had finished my manuscript, then this nasty virus came around, and I thought, okay, I'd better not publish something, and then people will think it's out of date within months. And then a UK publisher approached me about doing something quicker about how COVID-19 is changing things, and here we are. So this is if you like, a midterm assessment of what might be going on, and it is a story which is as much about potential opportunities as it is about actual changes. So that title could be just as easily how COVID-19 could be driving economic change, or perhaps even should be driving economic change. But my impression is that something is very definitely going on. I think this time is different in terms of economic change. There are new opportunities emerging, and the key question is how quickly, how sustainably will people jump on that. I will not talk about the details of COVID-19 because you all read the news, you all know what's going on, and this is a story that quite clearly keeps evolving. I think it's a story that in the Gulf has done the Gulf governments a lot of credit. When you look at how this is being handled in many European countries, many in North America, etc., I think the Gulf has done well, obviously with some cross-country differences. But what is significant about the GCC approach, if you like, is that I think governments in the region decided, okay, a year ago, we don't have a cure for this thing. We have to learn to live with this. We have to find a pragmatic approach. And for instance, in Bahrain, the focus was very much on building up testing capacity while trying to control the economic disruptions. And of course, now the emphasis has moved towards vaccination. So hopefully, soon enough, this thing will begin to subside, and this too shall pass, as they say. So now I'm trying to, can we put up the presentation? I have a short presentation that that summarizes these ideas.
Just share share the presentation.
I'll share, fine. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, clear.
All right. So this is just the summary, and it's the cover of the book. So looking into the future, which is still looking a little bit murky, but the bottom line is things are changing. This has been difficult, this has been challenging, but new opportunities on multiple levels are definitely emerging. But as I said, the big story here is not COVID-19. It is COVID-19 as a catalyst of change, as a stress test to the system. But the broader story is the story that the regional governments have been talking about for a long time, as you know. Probably the Saudi Vision 2030 is the most recent kind of well-known articulation of that. So if anybody ever thought that these plans about change were not right, were not needed, I think here's the proof that they are needed. Now, the big story here is that when we look at the regional growth dynamics, I think it's very clear that the region has reached an inflection point, a turning point. When I say the region is ready for chapter 3, what do I mean by that? So I think economists like to oversimplify things. I think the regional development journey since the 30s has progressed in two main chapters. One was a very long chapter, and it's what I call the oil government nexus. The government extracted oil, and then it spent those receipts on the rest of the economy in various ways. Clearly, the oil markets are changing. And as Amir said, the governments themselves are changing. So it's unlikely that we are going to get the kind of growth numbers we used to from the oil government nexus, at least not in a sustainable way. Then around the beginning of this millennium, we had what many people know as the kind of Dubai model, this very heavily infrastructure-led development model that was quite successful in putting the Gulf countries on the global map and creating connectivity and making infrastructure and real estate a significant development driver. This is what I call the great Arabian infrastructure boom. And if you look at that graph there, which gives you the growth rates for different countries, of course, during the first decade or so of this millennium, we had fantastic growth almost everywhere in the region. But what is clear is that those growth rates have slowed down everywhere. They've slowed down quite consistently, okay? And they have remained down almost regardless of what happened to the oil price, which is the thick black line. Obviously, you see the COVID drop there, but it doesn't fundamentally change the story. So we have gone from what used to be double-digit growth rates to something that is now very often in the order of maybe 2.5%. What's significant about this? Well, that's almost equal to the population growth rate in the region. So if 2.5% is what we get, it means that in practice, living standards will be stagnating. And in fact, they have been stagnating across the region for many years. So from a development perspective, this is not good enough. On the next slide, I have a bit more evidence on why it is clear that the old drivers are no longer doing what they used to do. So on the left there, you have the total fiscal situation of all the Gulf countries taken together. Those blue bars are the budget balance, and the orange line is the budget balance as a percentage of GDP. Well, you see the big drop since 2015. You see another drop, which is probably going to be around similar, roughly equal in size because of COVID-19. And these are the kinds of numbers that are really pushing up indebtedness quite rapidly across the region. And this is something that the regional countries will not be able to keep doing. No country will be able to keep doing for forever. And therefore, the fiscal consolidation agendas that came into play around 2015 have to continue. The encouraging news, I guess, is that the governments across the region have, broadly speaking, continued with those even during COVID-19, obviously with some modifications. Now, the right-hand graph refers to the infrastructure story. So what this, you all know the Mead magazine, what used to be the Mead magazine, I guess everything is digital by now. They've been collecting data on infrastructure projects for years. And these are the annual project awards in the different GCC countries. And you can very clearly see the initial boom. You can see the second boom that came during 2014 and came because the governments dramatically increased spending. But since then, two things have been happening. Number one, the economic impact of all this infrastructure spending is becoming weaker. Obviously, the more you build, the less likely you're going to get additional impact from the latest additions. And many sectors are already quite saturated. When we look at the real estate markets, it's quite clear that we are in a situation where people are still building, but demand is growing very slowly, if at all, because of the economic dynamics, because of the population dynamics, which the COVID-19 has accentuated further. The markets are responding. You can see that those project awards have come down quite significantly, but still, I think there is a significant imbalance that will continue for some time. So basically, all this is saying is we cannot expect this 2.5% growth problem to be fixed by the regional governments anytime soon. They don't have the money. I won't talk about what's happening to the global oil markets because I'm sure you are all more than familiar with the story. But the general expectation is that we are not suddenly going to have a massive oil boom that will keep giving for years and years. So growth will not come from the governments. It will not come through this established story of infrastructure spending. So where is it supposed to come from? And that really then only leaves one answer, which is that the private sector in the region should pick up the slack, okay? But what is very clear is that the private sector, of course, has a lot of structural weaknesses. Amir talked about some of them, the dependency on distorted prices, the dependency on government handouts, and also the private sector has not necessarily shown itself to be particularly strong in the face of this massive shock that the virus has delivered. Now, I have sort of divided the private sector into three pillars, if you like, three types of companies. In fact, these are to an extent overlapping pillars. Obviously, we have the big businesses, the commanding heights, if you like, which are typically the former government-owned businesses, the Aramcos and Sabics and Albas and so on, and financial sector companies, many of which are regulated by government. They tend to be listed companies. They don't usually have problems in terms of access to capital or access to talent. Then we have at the other extreme, the small and medium enterprises, the little guys, which is still very much dominated by what I call by the bazaar economy. And these are the micro enterprises that tend to operate in the retail sector or very basic services. When we look at, for instance, the recent growth of this segment in Bahrain, it's very much still about restaurants, cafes, small shops, beauty salons, bakeries, these kind of things. I'm sure it's a very similar story in Oman. A lot of these sectors quite heavily saturated, and these are sectors where activity is not really about future planning. It is about finding an area where you can expect to make money if you minimize your input costs. In the past, that was easy because you had all those subsidies. Nowadays, it's increasingly about a heavy reliance on low-cost expatriate labor. What these companies tend to do, I have that quote there from Michel Chatelus. This, by the way, is a quote from the 1980s, but still rings true. Getting access to the rent circuit is a greater preoccupation than reaching productive efficiency. The rent circuit is, of course, what used to be this government-led money that was flushing around in the economy. In the middle, we have this big amorphous category of family businesses, some of which are among the best companies in the region, some of which are really SMEs that are just controlled by families. So it's very difficult to generalize about them, but we've done a lot of analysis on this segment, and the general impression seems to be that these are typically companies that tend to continue to operate the way they always have. They are not companies that are interested in ongoing dynamic change, and they are sort of classic intermediaries. They buy and sell, or they subcontract, or whatever the case may be, very heavily focused on the home market rather than exporters. So the bottom line is we look at these two categories, the middle and the right, and I think very often these are businesses that are more about individuals, more about the businessmen than they are about the businesses as institutions. And because of that, they don't tend to be very responsive to changing economic circumstances. But if the bottom line is the private sector will have to lead, what is the probability of the private sector actually doing that? And here this very messy picture takes me to a story that I think is not receiving nearly the kind of attention that it should be. Bottom line is, if growth in the region is supposed to accelerate, it has to come from productivity. Because up to now, growth has come consistently from people putting in more capital and putting in more labor into the system, and because of this, they get more outputs. Productivity, of course, is about using those inputs more efficiently, getting more out of the same amount of inputs. The regional productivity track record, because of this history of extensive growth, is very bad. But I think the good news is that because it's bad, in a sense, because it's bad, it is possible to do something about it quite quickly. So if we can change the way companies operate from this old rent-seeking model, minimize your input costs, try to find areas where you can get a higher output cost, to one where people are constantly monitoring the way they operate and looking for the kinds of changes that can begin to improve their efficiency, then we have a chance. And why this matters is because internationally now people recognize more and more that productivity actually comes mainly from companies. It comes from companies working differently. We used to think productivity comes from people moving money from one sector to another sector. It tends to come increasingly from companies working better. And I put this in my tree of low-hanging fruit, the kinds of things that can help companies better manage their input costs, improve their productivity, expand their revenues, etc. I think these are all sort of self-explanatory enough, and you can see why this might happen. What's significant about COVID-19 is that it has shaken up this culture of continuity. It is forcing people to ask questions about the way they operate. They don't all have answers, but I think people are asking the right questions, and that is an important precondition for change. And what's quite interesting already is we've seen over and over that, for instance, when companies adopt digital solutions, for instance, you're a restaurant, there's a lockdown, you go with an online delivery service, and suddenly you can access your markets. So digitization has become a way for companies to stay in touch with their customers and with their partners. So it has become a lifeline, and it represents a big change from where we were before. So one thing that I think the region can be happy about, and this is not being talked about enough, is that this is the first time, I believe, in the more modern history of the Gulf, when companies are spending more money on technology than they are on low-cost labor. And this is exactly what they should be doing if productivity is supposed to be the way forward. if productivity becomes the way forward, then we can expect those growth numbers to begin to improve, because as I say, productivity historically has a very strong link to living standards everywhere in the world. So we've seen everywhere the numbers of low-cost laborers are going down. People are investing in technology, not necessarily well, not necessarily consistently, but directionally there has been a big change. Now, my next slide is probably the most boring slide in this presentation. Not that the others aren't, but still. But I think this is also probably the most important slide. You can see it doesn't have a lot of numbers. The reason it doesn't have numbers is because at this point we don't have a lot of data. Much of this builds on anecdotal evidence. A lot of it builds on data that at Tamkeen we have collected as we've tried to help Bahraini companies navigate through this storm. And what is clear is that things are changing. I'm not saying that they're changing completely or that they are changing rapidly, but something is going on. New opportunities are emerging, and what's interesting about these new opportunities is that they are actually aligned to these long-standing strategic priorities. They are aligned to the 2030 visions and programs of many governments. I already mentioned this digitization idea. Digitization has become a lifeline. It has created this technology bias. Obviously, in a population poor but capital-rich region, you want people to be competing on technology, not on low-cost labor. What's also very important about this is that Gulf companies, little by little, are beginning to jump on that bandwagon of ongoing change that other companies globally are doing. Because sticking with low-cost labor is a recipe in today's world for falling further and further behind. Point B, nimbleness is a key competitive advantage. What I mean by that is that a lot of companies year after year, decade after decade, kept doing what they've always done. Now they are asking questions. Now they are trying to find different ways of doing things. So these old, very rigid institutional practices are beginning to change. Point C, I think there is fundamental change happening in the labor markets. And this is not just a Gulf story, it is a global story. It may play out a little differently in different places, but what is happening could become a very, very good story in the Gulf countries. Why? Because first of all, the fact that we have now for about a year been living in a situation where people actually, in many cases, are working from home instead of coming to the office doing the old 9 to 5, means that work has become much, much more flexible. What we know from the global experience is that labor market flexibility is good for creating more jobs, because you can fill those different gaps in the labor market in different ways. And there are new ways for people to participate in the market, which is good for finding opportunity. One practical case of this is if we can move towards the situation where people can work from home, or significant numbers of people can work from home, this could create an opportunity, for instance, for Gulf women, who then no longer have to face a binary choice between career and family. Okay, they could work from home, which gives them flexibility, saves them time and money. They could potentially also work in a flexible way. They, for instance, get virtual corporate registration, what in Bahrain is known as Sijilli. They work when they have time, they don't work other time. There is a labor market convergence, I think, that is beginning to happen, in the sense that, you know, the Gulf labor markets have been very deeply divided between the national labor, mainly well-paid public sector jobs, and the private sector, which is mainly low-cost expatriate jobs. These low-cost expatriate numbers are going down. There is a new interest in bringing in and retaining talent. The new UAE law about naturalization, I know Oman has taken similar steps. At the same time, the readiness to work towards a more flexible market for nationals, part-time, self-employment, etc. And clearly the governments themselves are changing. Privatization is once again on the agenda, public-private partnerships, and regulatory reforms. Now, why do I think that this time is going to be different? This graph gives you the total government expenditure in the region since the year 2000, the blue bars, and the orange line is percentage of GDP. You can see what happened in the middle of this decade after the global economic crisis is that government expenditure went up very dramatically everywhere in the region, okay? This supported economic activity. It made it possible for people to delay a lot of these structural reforms. As I showed earlier, now we are at a point where because of deficits, because of government debt, this is no longer a possibility, which means that the fiscal consolidation will continue and economic incentives will drive change. Because if you have to pay the market price for things, you will not waste things in the same way as people have been wasting energy and water, for instance, for years. If you have to start paying market prices for labor, you become more interested in technology because technology no longer looks so expensive in comparison. And therefore, we can expect this change that has been accelerated by COVID-19 to continue. I have two very important points that I will make, and then I should be done. Number one, if we are in this economy where the government will be doing less, where companies will have to try to change the way they operate, we need new mechanisms for pooling and allocating capital. And the main mechanism in this regard has to be financial services. The time has come for the regional financial services sector to become serious about doing what financial services do. There has been a long-standing bias towards real estate, towards physical labor, towards the large companies. You can see from this graph on Dubai property prices or UAE property prices that it isn't paying off anymore. What do we need to do for the banks to start lending to more different activities? How can we revive the regional capital markets also outside of Saudi Arabia? How can we develop more pools of capital in the region? This is extremely important. One of the ways is pension reform. We know all the regional pension funds face significant problems. There is a need for private pensions. There's a need for venture capital, new kinds of investable assets, and transparency. This is an extremely important point because really, to a large extent, the way forward will depend on how quickly, how effectively the financial sector will diversify the way it works. It's very well for us to say companies need to work differently, but usually these changes come with a price tag. So where is the money supposed to come from? The other very important point is obviously whenever the going gets tough, then people focus on splitting the pie, and there's a lot of concern in today's world about the risks of openness. Obviously, the GCC countries are among the most open, economically open geographies globally. Okay, this has been a big source of vulnerability. The tourists stopped coming to Dubai, stopped coming to Oman, etc. There were disruptions to trade, etc. But while there were risks, it is very clear that this is not negotiable. Without openness, the the GCC cannot find sustainable prosperity, whatever the global context. I have on the left data on FDI. The region will have to revive the FDI narrative, and quickly. You can see those numbers have been coming down. Part of the reason why they were higher earlier was because of privatizations and PPPs. I think it's time to revive that. It's also time to get serious about attracting foreign capital into private local companies wherever possible. The trade numbers, okay, obviously oil shapes these numbers, but increasingly important for GCC companies to start exporting within the region, outside of the region. Part of this obviously is about regulatory reform, and there's been a lot of change towards 100% foreign ownership in the UAE, for instance. I think the region, because of the way it has handled the crisis, has a chance to kind of become, establish a first mover recovery advantage here if things are done right. So I've talked about a lot of opportunity. One thing I want to close on, this is my last slide, I promise, is everything in practice is complicated by what I call the cultural dimension. Old habits die hard. Culture is like this sticky syrup, tends to push us back to where we were before. And there are a lot of people who, once this crisis is over, and it will be over, I believe this year, then they want to go back to doing things the way they did them before. They want to start shipping people in from India, the Philippines, etc., operating on the basis that they did before. This would be a terrible mistake, and it would put a lot of these companies further behind the global norm, where technological change is now the new normal. I think there is an opportunity for the region to recognize this shock as a chance to do things differently, chance to do things better. And these opportunities that have opened up are, thankfully, all the kinds of things that can give us better productivity. And if we can take that productivity genie out of the bottle, then good things will come. I will leave it there, and I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. It's for a great, I think, really great presentation. I like it so much. It's very precise, very clear in its recommendations, and then actually analyzing the problem. We'll open now the chance for the attendees to raise their hands for questions. I don't see any hand yet raised.
Yeah, we can start with Mr. Simon Karam.
Okay.
You're ready? Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. As Amir has said, it's very precise, very profound, and yet simple to comprehend. The major changes that are taking place, the government position, the need to get the private sector to get involved in production, improving the productivity is very dear to our heart. You see, I have been in Oman for 50 years, and I had the chance to observe, like you, how we've developed, but from a different angle. I'm not an economist. I'm a tennis player. That's what I am.
Good for you.
And yeah, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. If we go to production and productivity, we know if we do not produce, we cannot survive long, whether we produce products or services. Now, we are still young. 50 years are not much in time, in the measure of time. I think we are not putting enough pressure on producing more what we know what to produce. We are losing lots of time in trying to invent, innovate, jump into, and all these are necessary, of course, but what do you think about giving more importance to what we know how to produce? I'll take the example of Oman. We know how to fish. we have to add or augment, enhance our production in fish before thinking of anything else, and use the technologies to develop that more and more, and be probably the prime place. We know how to mine and produce, mine not much. We don't have much technology, but that's something we can add our production in. You see, we're exporting. Yes, last year we were the first exporter of gypsum in the world, about 12 million tons. But how are we exporting it? We're exporting in aggregate stones, not a finished product at all. So we have all the elements of tourism industry, and I think, if I had a son now, I will probably teach him how to fish and not necessarily go into nanotechnology, but use the technology to know every fish where it is and how much it grew last year. Treat it with big data. So what I want to say, I want to thank you for your presentation, of course, but I want you, if you agree with me, to see if you agree that we must put, particularly in Oman, more concentration on productivity, as you mentioned. Thank you very much, Jarmo. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Simone. I think this is a fantastic comment. Couldn't agree more. And you should print this on the front page of all the Omani papers tomorrow, because everybody needs to hear this. See, when I say people need to use technology, I'm not saying let's make the Gulf like Silicon Valley. It doesn't make any sense. Every country has to play with the chips they've got, okay? What has the Gulf got? Well, it has a history of doing certain things, and quite well. I mean, what are the main natural resources? The main natural resources are hydrocarbons, oil and gas. Now, we all talk about oil and gas are becoming history, whatever. Yes, but not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, not within the next 50 years. And what is very interesting about what Aramco and Sabic, for instance, have been working on is thinking about, okay, can we do something different with oil instead of just exporting it as crude or refining it? The answer is probably yes. These are chemical compounds. You can do a lot of things with them. And if you find creative ways of doing this by harnessing technology and innovation, then you have future-proofing oil. The aluminium story in Bahrain, Amir's favorite topic. Now, I think Bahrain started out well and has missed a lot of opportunities. It has the world's biggest smelter. Bahrain should be at the cutting edge of aluminium innovation, producing all kinds of things that others in the world are not. Because let's be honest, we are using aluminium everywhere in today's world. It's needed. The prize goes to those people who can produce aluminium products better than anybody else. Now, what you said about fisheries is absolutely true. As I sometimes put it, you have to eat. Everybody has to eat. Fish is nutritionally good. It's something that Oman can produce, and it can create more value out of it by finding new ways of developing it and turning it into other products, etc., etc. So the point that I was trying to make in the private sector is, let's not throw away with what we've got, but let's take a good look at ourselves and see how we can do things better. Okay. And by the way, one of the things that I think regional companies have to get serious about, now that costs have gone up, and I think this will continue, also the labor market is changing, the minimum efficient scale of companies is going up. We have a very fragmented corporate sector. We have lots of tiny companies. One of the things that I would like to see Gulf companies do is start talking to each other, start partnering with each other, maybe one day do mergers and acquisitions so that we can have bigger and stronger companies that can then better compete in the regional and even in the international context. Because this region, okay, it may be population poor, relatively speaking. It has a fantastic location. It has fantastic connectivity. and it still has a lot of money. There are many things that the region can compete on, but this takes the will to succeed.
Can I do a little comment and I get out?
Sure.
I thank you very much for touching at a third area where we are strong, actually extremely strong. And that is the extraction of oil and gas.
Yeah.
You see, our oil in this country is difficult to extract. It's difficult because it's a series of small oil fields. We have about 120 oil fields to produce less than 1 million barrels. So it's deep, it is viscous, it's difficult to take out of the ground. And over the years, we developed a knowledge. We know now how to extract, use all the technology, EOR, whatever. And we are not exporting that knowledge.
Yeah.
Actually, we have to review all that. You see, it is big upstream operators who are benefiting from that, but not us as Omanis.
Yeah.
To benefit from that knowledge that we have.
You're
So this is an area also where we can export our knowledge. You see, and you talked about companies reviewing even excuse me, even a big company like PDO. One engineer, he got awarded. He's got an award last week. He looked at one facility for 2 years. He was observing, and he managed to save 20 megawatts without stopping any machine. 20 megawatts of energy in the middle of the desert were saved because he was looking again at, and in all companies, including our companies, you see, I have to confess that even in my company, I had to bring new blood to relook at everything, and they're doing fine. So thank you for bringing the oil and gas, because we are very strong at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Before going to Talal al-Ulagi question, which is in the chat, I just have a comment on the fish part. We have in Bahrain actually a company that is focused on a very niche market within this fishery, which is called Jarada fish. It's mainly on the type of fish that is required by the Far East, which they eat, okay, more. And I think it's doing very well. Such a smart businesses are there actually, okay? And we can learn from them in different fields, and it doesn't have to be the fish area. Anyway, the question from Talal al-Ulagi says, it's about the talent retention. He's asking about the talent retention through giving the rights to international talents to stay or to have citizens or neutralize or get a green card. He's asking Dr. Jarmo on how do you read the future of GCC in developing a flexible immigration system?
Okay. Now this, Amir knows, is a subject that I like to talk about. I think that GCC countries have done themselves a lot of harm by sticking with a completely outdated immigration labor system for the best part of a century. Why do I say that? Because they have made it very, very easy and cheap to bring in people who are holding back the economy, who are competing with modernization and technology, and who are delaying development. And quite frankly, stealing jobs from the locals. Not stealing directly, but stealing because they are letting companies operate in ways that don't create good jobs. Now, this has to change. I think it is beginning to change, but it has to be changed with a plan, which has to be measured. You cannot throw these people out because you will kill those companies while you're doing it. So it has to be a multi-year plan. When it comes to talent, okay, and I know we have all kinds of people coming to the Gulf, the good and the bad and the ugly, but they're internationally still okay. Talent comes at a premium. You cannot go wrong by attracting and retaining talented, hardworking people. Why do countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, why do they go out of their way to attract talent? Because they know this. And you look at places like even like Singapore known for fintech and many things. Who has built these sectors? The people who came to Singapore from elsewhere, but they are benefiting other people, they are benefiting the locals, and they are modernizing the economy. So I think the important thing is to, and I talk about this in the book, is to create a system where when there is a need in the economy, you welcome talented people, but you don't necessarily roll out the red carpet and pay them 10 times what you would pay the locals. Welcome them on terms that are fair, okay? You give them residency, you give them the prospect of staying if they want to, but then they pay GOSI, they operate in a labor market that is fair to everybody. And if you do this to people, and I think this is what is driving a lot of the changes in the Emirates as well. So for years we've said, oh, these foreigners, they remit all their money back home. But part of the reason why they've done that is because it hasn't been easy for them to invest locally, partly because they didn't know how long they would stay, partly because there were many things they couldn't buy, partly because there was no system locally for them to, for instance, save towards their pensions. Now, all the regional labor laws talk about end of service benefits. What is preventing the GCC governments for turning that into a pension fund? You keep saving locally, the money earns a return. When you leave, if you leave, you can take that money with you. You can invest in local property if you have a proper mortgage market. And if you leave, you sell that property. If you stay, it's yours to leave to your children. So this is going to stop all this tactical nonsense that I think has been distorting the market and creating the wrong incentives to a lot of people. But all I'm saying is do it right. Don't jump to a magic bullet solution because there are no magic bullets. Find a solution that works and that is fair to all concerned. When we look at Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., these guys give you full residency, but then you pay your taxes, you pay your social insurance contributions, you pay your medical insurance, everything.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. We have a question from Dr. Ali Hamdan, and I could see him coming up with this camera. So better to ask the question yourself, or shall I just read it? Okay.
You can go ahead and read them. It's very clear and straightforward. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ali Hamdan is asking about the private universities and the challenges they face with regard to the financial challenges they face. And they want your opinion, Dr. Jarmo, about how will balance between generating income and assuring a quality delivering online courses through e-learning.
Well, that's a big question. It's a very good question, but it's a big question. I do think that the training and education market is being dramatically disrupted in today's world by technology. And anybody who thinks that they can ignore this change is wrong. What this will mean is that in a certain sense, the price tag of learning is coming down, because online learning is cheaper, but your potential client pool, if you can find it, is becoming bigger. So the model, the formula for success is changing, and I think institutions will have to adapt to that. I think technology will be absolutely critical. It's important to make sure that the private universities in the region are properly regulated. And I think that this is an area where regulators could also perhaps push these institutions to do more in terms of technology, in terms of standards. I suspect in the private university space, the situation is not that different from many other market segments. We went through a period when the regulations became more liberal. The market was changing because population numbers were growing up, disposable incomes were going up. Now we are seeing a much more stagnant market. I suspect that we will see some consolidation in this sector. And some of these private universities will have to consolidate, learn to work with each other, create bigger entities, potentially develop partnerships with entities outside of the region, or perhaps within the region. I mean, what is in principle preventing, let's say, an Omani and a Bahraini institution from coming together and, quite frankly, then delivering a stronger value proposition to their students?
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. I have Dr. Abdallah Ba'aboud is raising his hand, so the floor is yours. Dr. Abdallah.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm moving around, so I'll try and find a place to sit. Basically, I want to echo my colleagues who thank the speaker. It's been a great session. We learned a lot from this. I have a question, and it relates to what the speaker has just said, that the nature and the trajectory of the Gulf states' economies meant that the state is a major player in the economy, and it continues to be so. Now, that is true to a very large extent. And my question is, or relating to that, we have seen that there is a growth of SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And they have been done for some good reasons. Some of them is that because of the fact that they do want to invest in some strategic sectors, or because there are sectors that the private sector is not yet ready to invest in, etc. So we see that the state started to invest in these, and they became government-owned companies or state-owned companies. Now, what is happening here is that there has been some crowding out of the private sector. It's not only in terms of competing with them in providing goods and services, but also in competing with them for funding and finance. And this mainly affects the middle portion that the speaker has just mentioned, where you have very small companies, and that is, people providing, restaurants and foods and etc. But the middle sector, which is the SMEs, the small scale industries, the even some of the family conglomerates, etc., it's been badly affected. Now the question is, where do one draw the line to where this growth of SOEs, and how can you actually grow a proper private sector when your policies is crowding them out and pushing them out of the market? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I must say, these are fantastic questions you're asking, so thank you for giving me a hard time. I think that it's true that in the region, of course, the governments have a long history of driving economic change. A lot of these diversification ventures for decades have been government-led. And obviously it is the case even today, okay, that there's a big disproportion in resources between the government and the private sector, which is what is driving this crowding out that you are seeing. I think to an extent that's even happening between the family businesses and some of these SMEs, and certainly a lot of SME entrepreneurs are complaining about the fact that they are getting a hard time from the family businesses. I think this is reflective of two things. Number one, we still live in an environment where having access to pools of cash is important. Obviously, the government has the biggest pool, and the big families have smaller pools, but they have bigger pools than other guys. And this matters because the banks are not lending enough to the little guys to enable them to survive or to compete. And this calls for the need, okay, because for the need to diversify the government sector, the financial sector. The other thing that is a big problem, okay, and this doesn't get talked about very much. I have some discussion of this in the book, is competition law. Now, competition law is one of these things that few people get excited about. It's not a topic that is very much talked about in the region because it doesn't have a long history in the region. But internationally, competition, effective market competition, is in fact the most important driver of productivity. What you have described there, Mr. Abdullah, is a situation where the market is not competitive because the big guys can essentially marginalize the little guys. There is nobody to effectively protect the interests of the little guys because the competition enforcement is not working the way it should be or is not working at all. Now, one of the things that I did during this project is I looked at the competition laws in the region, and they don't tend to be very effectively enforced, with all due respect. It's not that they are not enforced at all, but they're a little bit unevenly enforced. And in many countries, in fact, government-owned enterprises are not covered by competition laws. So if the government competes with the private sector, it can do that, and the government will not come and slap itself on the hand. This is a problem. So I think one of the things that will have to start to happen after COVID is governments will have to become much more serious about competition monitoring and the enforcement of the competition law. The financial sector will have to develop better ways of supporting private sector companies. But I think also, quite frankly, private sector companies will have to fight back. Now, I realize most of them will not be able to do this alone, but this takes me back to this idea of consolidation, partnerships, mergers and acquisitions. One of the long-standing anomalies of the Gulf corporate sector is this idea that entrepreneurship is a one-man show or a one-woman show. It's usually a man. That you have to be a solo flyer when you're an entrepreneur. And we are, by the way, seeing this even with the startup companies now. Most of them are one-person shows. Internationally, startup companies usually have 2 to 4 founders. In the Gulf, they have 1 founder. When you have more people involved in the running of a company, you have more access to capital, you have a bigger Rolodex, you have a bigger pool of talent and experience, and you have all kinds of synergies. So I think this is one of these moments in history where private companies can enhance their case by fighting back, by coming together, by pooling their resources. I know that's easier said than done, but if this process doesn't start now, when is it going to start? The other thing, of course, finally, about the government is, okay, even if the government wants to seed different ventures, start out different ventures, I think part of making the competitive landscape work properly is that it doesn't remain the sole owner forever. It is open to the idea of partial privatizations. It is open to the idea of engaging with the private sector in a variety of ways. I think part of getting it right in terms of the government role going forward is that you find ways of taking chunks of the government sector, chopping them out and moving them to the private sector, either partially or completely. And this has to be an ongoing process. It happened at the beginning of the century, but then people kind of lost the interest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. The next question we have from His Excellency Khamis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It was interesting. You have spoken about the efficiency, digitalization, and investment banking role, and of course other things. To be fair, more fair with the region, I think in the last 5 years, we have been seeing a lot of high efficiency in digitalization in all sectors, in most of the countries. And I think we have state of art of services, paying bills, everything all online. Without efficiency, which we have 5 years, it will be very difficult for many companies and many schools, many work from home, or that a part of some issues or with regard with remote area, most of the people have been able to work clearly, but in a good way, online from distance. So I want to be more fair with the region and be a little bit concerned about your digitalization evaluation of the region. Number two, I think COVID-19 have taught us to move from regionalization to entire world. So I don't think the aspect of a company in Dubai and company in Saudi Arabia should join together to work in the region, because both of two markets are very small, as you know. The entire region of GCC countries is very, very small. Only option is to go for international market, and efficiency and digitalization should be to that direction. That is the only way out. So this is my general comment on this. Maybe you'd like to elaborate more. And I want to see also what you see the sectors post COVID-19 we should investigate. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Khamis. Let me be clear. I also want to be fair to the region. By no means do I want to suggest that nothing has happened. I think change has been happening in many areas. And of course, there are some absolutely cutting edge ventures in the region. What I am saying, though, is that when we look at the private sector, okay, beneath the bigger companies, what we found very clearly is that when this shock came, a lot of the smaller companies were not ready. They had no plan B. And they had no plan B because they had not invested in digitization, online delivery channels, etc. And certainly when we look at, for instance, the recent developments in the Bahraini market, we've seen still massive investments going into physical retail facilities at a time when globally it is online commerce that is taking off. And I think many Bahraini companies, and I know it's not just Bahrain, they suffered, okay, when they didn't have a plan B during the crisis. Who won? Amazon.com won. People started ordering stuff from Amazon as opposed to when they just could not get it from local companies. So what I'm talking about is really about expanding this digitization footprint, expanding those success stories that you so rightly talked about, and making this a more universal experience in the region. Now, your point about the Gulf market is a small market is a very valid point. Not only is it a small market, in many areas it's quite a saturated market. And of course, when you look at, for instance, Dubai, it's very contested, very aggressively competitive, because everybody has come and tried to set up shop. Now, and therefore it's only logical that this internationalization should be the way forward. I do think that, realistically speaking, internationalization is one of those things which is sort of nice work if you can get it. So for many companies, the knowledge isn't there, the contacts aren't there. There are companies which have that, okay, and I think that you are quite right, they should go ahead. But in the short term, it may make sense for many businesses to start more locally. That's where they know people. That's where they are in a position to develop an initial way forward. And at the end of the day, what I'm talking about is building up scale. And there is scale to be built even locally. Potentially, you look at some of the retail streets, potentially with your next door neighbor. But once that process gets unleashed, I think going regional and going international is a logical sort of end result. And by the way, one thing that the Gulf countries should do as well is, and this is maybe taking a leaf out of the privatization playbook of the early 2000s, is I think it should become easier for foreign capital to invest in local companies, especially when that foreign capital then comes with other added benefits, complementarities, new technologies, etc. Because the more that happens, the stronger the incentives are about creating businesses that can compete internationally. So I don't disagree with you at all about your comments. I think what we are talking about with many of these stories is, at what point in the journey are we? The most important issue to me is that the journey should continue in the direction that you have outlined. Now, you talked about sectors post COVID-19, which is an important question and a question on many people's minds. I'm personally not a big fan of these sector questions. Why? Because I think in many cases, there is a bigger opportunity for change within sectors than by shifting from one sector to another. So going back to the earlier conversations we had about how local businesses can learn to work better, how to overhaul the business models of existing businesses. It's clear. For instance, healthcare provision is changing, telehealth, digital health, etc. Education, we talked about earlier, is changing. Clearly, this technology story in general is going to be attracting a lot more capital. So if I had to give you one idea, that would probably be it. But you see opportunity everywhere. One of the things that this crisis has reminded people of is food security. And there's a big opportunity to apply new technologies to produce more and better food locally, much more cost effectively. One sector, okay, that I think is in serious trouble in the near term is real estate, but that is a big opportunity as well. So how can somebody go out there and reinvent the way these shopping malls work, or overhaul some other segments of the real estate sector, whether it is by enhancing energy efficiency, finding more cost-effective ways of generating energy, or just developing different ways of offering real estate services to the customer base out there, because I do think that the demand dynamics have changed, and clearly we are looking at a highly competitive marketplace in the years ahead. One of the things that's still where the region still, for the most part, lags behind, although there's been good change happening, is the market. The real estate market is not a very efficient market. There's been moves towards greater transparency, more efficient price formation, but that is one area where more could be done. Because if it becomes a more efficient market, it means it's a less risky market, and capital will come in more readily when they have confidence in the prices and they feel that the prices reflect the market dynamic.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. I think we'll let our host, His Excellency Khalil Khonji, to speak or ask his question instead of writing his comments. So please, we'd like to see you.
Thank you, Amir. Now, my question was, thank you, the speaker. My question was regarding the taxes and VAT, syntax, charging higher electricity bill, water bill. All of a sudden, the GCC government has been applying so many things at one time. What is your advice to the decision makers regarding this? And even they are differentiating between the foreigners and locals in electricity bills. Mm-hmm. So in some GCC country, yeah. What is your say on this? Thank you.
Well, why did we end up in this situation? We ended up in this situation because we knew for a long time this had to be done, but then some decisions were delayed until essentially governments ran out of alternatives. So they had to be implemented quite quickly in the post 2014 environment, when the oil market realities changed and the governments no longer had the appetite or the money to sort of increase spending in the way that they had after the global financial crisis. I am, for better or worse, I am an economist, and I think that one of the most important aspects of an economy is the price system. The price system performs a very important role in any economy in terms of efficiently allocating resources. So having market-based pricing of energy, of water, etc., is important, because we all know when water and energy were very cheap, people wasted. They consumed much, much more than they should have. And in some cases, by doing so, they reduced the competitiveness of local businesses because they didn't invest in efficiency and innovation in the way they should be. So getting rid of this waste is a good idea. What I think is important for the governments to do is to clearly communicate to the people what is coming, why this is being done, and very importantly, what can they do about it? Okay, because for instance, when your electricity bill starts going up, there are things you can do. For instance, you could put in sensors, you could monitor your consumption, you could do an energy audit and see where you are wasting energy, you could improve your insulation. And obviously now you could do solar energy in many cases if your tariffs are high enough. I think one of the problems that we saw, for instance, in Bahrain, is that we didn't have proper funding mechanisms in place for these things. So people started paying more for their electricity, but they didn't necessarily find it very easy then to go and find alternative energy solutions. Many of them wanted, but they didn't have the money. They didn't have the board of directors support. And this is where financial services matter. So then you have to have either credit solutions or these ESCO solutions where somebody builds the stuff for you and then you pay it back over many, many years. This is about regulation. And this is about engaging the financial sector in new ways. Now, taxation. I think taxation in the Gulf countries is needed because the governments need to diversify their revenues. I mean, it's very clear that depending heavily on oil revenues is risky, given the uncertainties in the oil market. You might have some good years, but there's also a risk that you might have some bad years. And there is one thing that energy economists are increasingly warning about, which is something known as the green paradox. So if people think that the oil era is coming to an end, and you have a lot of oil, then you have an incentive to start producing your oil as quickly as possible and selling it at any price. And obviously that would then have implications for the fiscal models of a lot of these countries. I'm not saying that this will necessarily happen, but we all have to recognize today that risk exists. I think with this taxation thing, again, it is important to have clear communication. Why is this being done? Okay. And if there are risks or problems that it is creating, how do you deal with those risks? So for instance, if you introduce VAT, how do you protect those people who don't have a lot of money? Okay. And one of the interesting developments, of course, in the region is that the idea of welfare provision is changing. It used to be everything was cheap and everybody got the same universal subsidies. Now we need something that is more like the Saudi citizens' accounts, where some support is provided to people, but then people who are in need get more government support. So not everybody gets the same. Your support is based on your need. I think that the other advantage, quite frankly, of creating a system of taxation, very much underappreciated, is that why do Western countries have so much information about all kinds of economic activity? Because of taxation. People have to pay tax, they have to report their revenues, they have to report their income. And once you start getting all this economic data, you can start drafting better economic policy. A lot of the time we have been shooting in the dark, we didn't have the information. I think taxation can potentially then begin to change that. And having that information is not just good for the government, it's also good for the companies, because when you have to produce serious accounts, you have clear visibility on what are you spending on, what are you earning, what are the things where you could potentially do things differently. And this can then begin to drive better governance at the company level. So don't worry, I'm not a tax and spend liberal. I'm not a big fan of taxes, but I do think taxes have a role to play. And if they are introduced in a way that is properly planned and gradually implemented, I think they can actually play a very positive role in this economy.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's as Dr. Abdullah al-Bahrani has said earlier in a different lecture, there is a new social contract between the governments and the public and the people. But how to communicate this, that is very important. And I think the timing, you have not said anything about the timing. Is it the right time to apply all of these things together at one time with COVID, where businesses are struggling and people are struggling?
Yeah, sometimes the right question is not, is it the right time? Sometimes you run out of alternatives and it's the only time. And I think that unfortunately is the situation where some governments now are. What I think is important is that it's done gradually and people are kept informed and the most vulnerable people are compensated. Because obviously What is also significant here is that if the governments can diversify their revenues, okay, they are less vulnerable to economic risks, but they also then can secure the future of those services that governments need to provide to the population. Because if you have the money to do that, then obviously in the end your citizens will be better off. And I think that is a positive message. And it's interesting, for instance, when in the Northern European countries, which of course have a global reputation for high taxes, when people are asked about how do you feel about paying half of your income in taxes, most people are actually quite happy, and they are quite happy because they feel that the government gives them back.
Can I?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Talking about taxes, particularly in GCC, one would wonder if the existing taxes are being implemented properly, and whether the government is collecting the money is due. I think in many countries, the corporate tax is not being collected fairly and from everybody. You see, we have in Oman we're close to 400,000 registered CRs, commercial registration, and I don't want to commit myself by saying how many pay tax, corporate tax. But I do know that the huge majority is not submitting their accounts and therefore not paying tax. I reckon myself that if the corporate tax is implemented as it should be, as per the law, we don't need VAT for another 3-4 years. The compensation is so big, that, and you're economist, you can deduce it from our GDP, from whatever source. So maybe, and that's why His Excellency Khalil was asking about the timing. I would have thought that if we strictly implement the existing laws and leave the others for a little while, the end result is the same. And what you touched on is so important in collecting the statistics, the data from these taxes is incredible. What an enlightening idea. So if we have 100 taxes and only partially implemented, the statistics are going to be false and misleading. At any rate, thank you.
Yes. No, I think this is an important point. I don't think you will find any country anywhere in the world where taxes are paid by everybody on the scale that they should be paid, because let's be honest, people don't like paying taxes. But quite clearly in the region, the tax administrations are usually fairly weak, so they don't necessarily go out there and collect taxes from everybody the way they should. The nature of corporate reporting is not necessarily always very developed, and that can further complicate matters. You doubtless know the Omani situation much better than I do. What you say rings true, but I think it still leaves the issue that you having some more diversity, some more resilience in the tax base is probably a good idea. The VAT, as it's being introduced, has been introduced in parts of the region at 5%, and in some countries with significant exemptions, is not a very disruptive tax. And if through those exemptions, you can potentially then protect the poor and protect certain kinds of activities. So economically speaking, VAT is what most people would consider a good tax, in the sense that it doesn't distort economic activity very much. So my vote would still be for getting it started, but then obviously studying the data, seeing how it goes, and learning from your experiences. I think one other area where the region could do more with taxation is the real estate market, because the real estate market needs more information to become an efficient market, and taxation can help with that. But it can also then help correct some of those market imbalances potentially, if there are certain areas where we are seeing more sort of excess activity, if you like. Taxation is one of the ways in which you can potentially condition people's behavior.
Yeah, but again, elaborating a little bit more on the timing, you see, you have also to take into account the psychology of the people, the general perception of the people.
Yes.
The common man on the street, how is he feeling about these things? And many of them are not involved in that thing, but the general atmosphere,
Yeah.
is such that it's much easier for me, Simon Karam, to pay as much tax as you want from a profit that I make. If
Yeah.
I'm making profit, no problem.
Yes.
But if you make me pay tax on something I've not used yet, or whatever, and that affects the consumer and affects the population. So I think the psychological mood should be taken into account for the timing as well, because it may lead to instability. I hope not.
Thank
Well,
you. We'll ask Haji Adam to elaborate on this, please. Haji Adam.
He will give a military opinion.
سعادة خميس عنده كومنت كذلك قاعد ينتظر.
زين.
تفضل. تفضل سعادة خميس أول عقب بنروح للأخ آدم.
شكرا. I find myself again in disagreement with our speaker. 2007 and 2008, the entire world were collapsed because of the real estate issues, and it started from the most civilized, transparent economies in the world. So, and in contrary, I think in Oman, I don't know other places which you are covering your research. In Oman, this sector is very transparent, and a lot of involvement from the authority side. And I think more tax in this sector will have a negative impact on the growth. Then also, I will disagree that more taxation will lead more transparency and will lead more growth. I think taxation have to be, as my friend and my partner, Mr. Semun, said, it have to be well studied, and to see the actual impact of that on the other people. To go and generalize that let's have tax here because we need transparency and we need more information. Let's add real estate tax. I think this is need to be addressed in other issue, in other way. More taxation will slow the economies of the entire region. Thank you.
Look, I respect your comments, and obviously one of the challenges of talking about the Gulf countries as a whole is they are not identical. There are differences between the markets. If we compare the let's say the Dubai real estate market with the Bahraini real estate market, the Dubai market is a lot more transparent, a lot more efficient, and they've been investing in this efficiency for a long time, and I'm perfectly willing to accept that the situation in Oman is also different from what it is here. So I completely hear you. Let me just say that your point about taxation is not good for growth is true. It isn't good for growth ever. You introduce taxes and you reduce growth. But I think what I am talking about is what is driving the rise of taxation at this point is the fact that the governments will need to have a sustainable fiscal model. And I, as I said before, taxation, you should study it. You should study it before. You should study it after. Studying it after is easier than studying it before because you'll have more information. And you need to do it with proper communication, and you need to do it gradually. And when I say introduce taxes on the real estate sector, I am not saying slam them on at 50%. I'm just saying if there are certain segments of the market that are oversupplied, then that is probably an area where you want to discourage people from adding to the supply, and introducing some more taxation there is efficient. The other advantage, of course, of taxes, and I don't know, I find myself in a funny position here because I am not a big fan of taxes, and here I am singing the praises of taxes. But the other advantage of taxes is that they are an economic policy tool. So you can change them up, you can also change them down. And what has happened, for instance, in many countries during economic crises is that then the governments can reduce taxes and create a little bit more flexibility for companies and individuals during a difficult time. Obviously, it's difficult to reduce something that doesn't exist. So in that sense, by having a strategy for a system of taxation that is gradually implemented, will give you more resilience and will give you more flexibility in terms of economic policy. But where I completely agree with you is that I think that low taxes are better than high taxes. So this has to be done very gradually, and you don't want to have a big government sector that spends people's money in ways that it thinks is best, because the government usually doesn't know better.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. We have 4 more.
Maybe if you allow me just to finish my point also. I do agree with you, but I will talk to you. You are economist, and the economy always have 2 things in 2 hands.
Yeah.
I agree. In one hand, you have the government return of income sustainability, and in other hand, we need a growth for job creation.
Yeah.
Job creation for more economic stable.
Yeah.
Without these 2 going together, without two things going together, I think we'll face difficulties.
You are absolutely right. This is why I am saying that taxation has to be part of a general strategy. It's not something that anybody should do in isolation. But I am also saying that it is probably impossible at this point not to do more in that particular area.
Okay, we have only 15 minutes left roughly, so I would suggest that we listen to the 4 comments together, one after the other, and then Dr. Jarmo can, comment or reply to the 4 questions or comments together. So we'll start with Haji Adam. Please just be precise and short so that we can cover everybody's in the coming few minutes. Haji Adam.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not an economist and I'm not a businessman. But what I see in our country, I listen to everybody here. We love investing in concrete jungles. Mm-hmm. If we talk about Dubai, the way we see it, it's a 5-star maybe service hotel. Do we want an economy like Dubai's economy? The other thing, every now and then we hear, we should allow, people coming into Oman with resident permits, staying in Oman, investing in Oman. We have enough people here in Oman, and between us here, locals, there is plenty of cash available that somebody should pick on this and make some good out of it. Mm-hmm. But because, we Omanis have lost trust in each other, and there have been disasters and some investment activities. The strange thing is that the people who were responsible for maybe some activities, while in the government, they were not good, but when they run their own companies, they are very, very good. So there is a problem. There is a technical problem we have here. If you go around now, for example, if you want 10 billion riyals Omani, maybe in 2 months' time, we'll find it in Oman to create an investment fund. But nobody will be willing because they have no trust in whatever the government or the private sector here claims. So I don't know. Maybe this is also in Bahrain and in other places. I think we need to solve this problem first. We need to restore trust of the citizens. We have the manpower. We have the drive. We were good, and we can be good. Thank you.
So shall we hear the next one? So that just because of the time, we're very short. Mr. Muhammad Habib, I believe you have some comments. محمد حبيب. أنا أتكلم عادي. ما تسمعوني؟ محمد حبيب.
عصامت محمد. He has to
Yeah, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to expand on what you mentioned, Speaker. We've been talking in the GCC about diversification for the last 30 to 40 years. And we have not moved much or succeeded. I can go further. And you mentioned one or two things. That one of the things is the government involvement in the private sector work where they're monopolized. Number two, you mentioned that they should be privatizing, leaving into the private sector. I see it, and see if I'm wrong. I see it that the government to diversify, they should allow the private sector to do the projects rather than government getting involved as a strategic partner, and the chain of approvals of the government is long, so it delays it and doesn't give much of a confidence to the private sector. I feel the government's role should be actually providing the infrastructure and the facilities and laws and regulations to make it easier for the diversification to go up. Do you agree on that? How it is the situation here? I mean, I'm giving an example of UK. When UK wants to get involved in giving the private sectors some facilities, they said, okay, if you're moving into Swansea, we'll give you the whole factory, the infrastructure, everything, no taxation for 5 years, and just employ the people. And that has been a very success stories in the Western world. Shouldn't we be implementing such thing like here? To diversify our economy from oil and gas?
Yes, I'll answer that shortly. Let's hear the other questions.
Okay, we will hear from, I think, Mr. Khalil Khonji. You have?
Mr. Munir.
Munir, okay. تفضل أخ منير. ما زلت أعتقد على ميوت الأخ منير. أيوه تفضل. تفضل منير نسمعك.
الصوت ما واضح.
ما نسمعك. ما زال الصوت غير مسموع.
طيب ممكن نعطي chance أعتقد Dr. Jarmo to just answer the questions until Mr. Munir is ready.
Sure.
Okay, let's do that in the interest of time. Number one, your point about concrete jungles is very true. And let's be honest, a lot of people in the region looked at Dubai with envy and based a lot of their policies and choices on trying to emulate what happened in Dubai. And at the end of the day, Dubai is Dubai, and you don't need to have many Dubais all over the place. Elements of the strategy worth considering, but don't cut and paste. Your point about local investors and local capital is a valid point. And look, when I said that countries should be open to talent, I didn't mean throw open the doors and windows and let everybody walk in, not at all. I think that has been happening too much at the lower end of the market. You see, you need an immigration regulation and you can change the rules. You can say, okay, this year we need 50 engineers, you bring in 50 engineers. You don't need to commit to something that you cannot control. I think the idea of trust is very critical. And trust has to be at the heart of efficient financial intermediation. And you have to really invest across the region, whether it is in government or in financial services or at the level of individual companies, much more in governance, making sure that things are properly discussed, they are transparently documented, etc. And people need to pay attention to what is going on. I think one of the problems that we've had with many good ideas even, okay, is the fact that at the end of the day, economic change is not simple. It's usually not a completely clean and clear-cut process. And sometimes we try out something and people say, "Oof, it didn't work out. Look at all these consequences. Let's give up." I think there has to be a willingness to monitor your results and keep tweaking, keep improving, keep learning from your mistakes. I mean, when at first you don't succeed, try again. And I think that one of the problems we've had historically is this silver bullet, this magic bullet mentality. We have a problem, how do we fix it? Who can give us the solution? Let's bring in McKinsey, let's bring in whatever, KPMG, and here is the solution, let's implement it, now everything will be fixed. The world does not work like that. One has to be able to monitor the results and learn from one's mistakes. And I think that having a process like that in place is where confidence and trust then comes from, because you can see that there is a sincere desire on people's part to learn from your mistakes. Now, the other point about diversification, you are absolutely right. I think the government, we talked about trust, the governments have to have more confidence in the private sector. You cannot talk about empowering the private sector for 30 years and then step on the toes of the private sector at every opportunity. The governments need to learn to practice what they preach. What I think the new model should be about is make it easier for the private sector to do things, enable the private sector to do the kinds of things that the government used to do in many areas, but then regulate them, have proper transparency, have proper regulation. I mean, the Bahrain Economic Vision 2030, which came out, a little over a decade ago, I think 2008, it was approved. It explicitly talks about the government becoming a regulator instead of doing things directly. This is a very good aspiration. It hasn't always played out that way in practice, but you want to empower the private sector. Empower the private sector. What you described is the way to do it. So I fully agree with you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. Maybe we'll hear now from Munir.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm very sorry I came a little bit late for the meeting, and what I heard was, I think, maybe about half an hour of the main speaker's points. And it's very interesting what has been said, and the participation of the individuals that came on also was very interesting. But I think one thing which is have been amiss in this whole the whole session that we just heard is actually I'm not talking about a specific country. I'm talking about the GCC as a whole, whether it's as a whole or as individual countries. Is that in any economy it's very important that we have set the laws, regulation, protections, and everything. And above all is the economic plan for any specific period. And if there is an economic plan and there are exactly the roles and required by both sides, whether it's government side or the private sector, should be very clear, very transparent, and at the same time, no changing of the goalposts at any time during, unless it is for the better. Now, what I want to say is that there are two issues that are involved. First of all, is that the regulators in the GCC, sometimes we have a new government or a new minister or a new undersecretary, whatever it is. Suddenly he has an idea and he comes up with a decision, a ministerial decision that really truly affects negatively the private sector without having gone to make a coordination with the relevant ministries. So there is no play, they are not playing as a team. The economy has to be governed by a team of people who are different ministries, and they have to talk to each other and try to, before making major decisions, at least consult with the private sector and especially with the Chamber of Commerce and so on. So now the issues here with the regulator are two things. First of all, there are internal things like this. And secondly, external pressures coming, suddenly political issues coming out in the region, and suddenly one government takes a different position and so on and so on. That can also have a great effect, as we have seen in the past. I don't want to mention any specific thing, but we have seen external issues have come to impact business in the area. The other issue, which is very, very important, is now the social media plays an important role, a negative important role, because individual people who have no stake in the private sector are creating a lot of pressure on the governments in the area, and at the same time on the parliaments that we have here, or whether the Majlis Shura, whether it is parliament, whatever it is, they are creating unnecessary, pressure, so that these ministries or these individuals in the government will take measures that are not popular with the private sector, and because of pressure and not because of any design. So basically, the team that has to lead the economy has to converse with each other first, to converse with the private sector, and have a plan, have an economic plan that is doable. Without that, if we just have every Tom, Dick, and Harry coming in and putting tweets or this, and suddenly the ministers change their decisions, that is extremely dangerous. So that's what I wanted to basically interject here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Munir. Couldn't agree more. And Amir can tell you, I am a big believer in economic planning, and if you read my book, as I hope you will find a lot of discussion around this idea. But I think that it's important also for the planning and policymaking process in the region to, if you like, grow up. What do I mean by that? Sometimes people have an excessive faith in a plan that is produced, let's say, every 5 years, and then the world changes, as it always does, and some of the plans seem irrelevant, and then people don't have the capacity to adapt appropriately to those plans. So the plan is thrown away without any thought, and you end up in a limbo. I think that planning is not just about producing a document, it is about implementation and monitoring just as much, and there has to be proper capacity in this area. I think your point about good regulatory practice is extremely, extremely important, and developing regulations, yes, has to be embedded in a process that starts with consultations. And I think the people who are regulated, the entities that are regulated, have the right to respect a fair process. And what I mean by that, a process where the rules don't change suddenly and they don't keep changing, because part of good regulatory practice is predictability, but also you have a proper mechanism then for people to address points that are not working or treatment that is unfair. So this is, I think, particularly important in the area of competition. So one of the things If the region is serious about productivity, is that there has to be a proper competition enforcement authority in the years ahead. I think that your point about the
social media.
No, not social media. So I think also the private sector, your point about the chambers of commerce, I think the private sector needs to become a little bit more vocal, but become a little bit more vocal with responsibility. It is very easy to say, oh, the government is doing this wrong, the government is doing that wrong, it's bad, it's inefficient, whatever. Ask the question of what would you do? How would you do things differently? I think the discussion needs to move from negative criticism to one where, for instance, what do these political lobby groups, business lobby groups in the West do? They invest very heavily in research. They produce alternative plans and strategies that they are always submitting to the governments for consideration. And some governments, believe it or not, actually pay attention and respond to those plans. I think this kind of capacity building is very much needed in the region as well. Your point about regional coordination, I know this is a subject that is not within my area of expertise necessarily, but it's an important point. Part of creating a stronger Gulf economy is making sure that there is regional coordination and some of those rules that are implemented at the national level are then reasonably coordinated at the regional level as well. Social media, well, this has become the world's most efficient factory of nonsense, it seems, unfortunately. I think that part of getting it right is having more sources of sanity, having the chambers of commerce, the business lobbies do more serious research and analysis, create and produce more data that is real data that people can trust and people can verify, but also moving towards a proper regulatory process. Now, for instance, in the European Union, and I'm not saying the European Union is a perfect bureaucracy because it most certainly isn't, but essentially you cannot introduce a new regulation or law without doing a proper impact assessment before. You need to do an economic analysis where you show how things will change if you introduce a particular regulation. Now, this is something that is a good thing to do because it forces you to think about the consequences of your decisions and forces you to develop decisions that then don't have to be modified again the next week. Obviously, you don't always get things right, but when you build capacity in these areas, by and large, it seems to be working. So I think all your points, very, very important points. And I do hope that the regional business establishment will step to the plate because it's difficult for the private sector to lead if the private sector is not ready to show leadership.
We can't agree more. Thank you, Dr. Jarmo. It has been an excellent presentation, I believe so. And the discussions after the presentation were quite fruitful. If I just summarize, and then I'll have one more comment. I didn't have the chance to say it during those 2 hours, is that I will focus on the 5 points you mentioned about going more into the technology to improve the productivity and focusing on competitive advantage. And the fact that the work is changing, it's getting more flexible. The labor market convergence is happening with regard that it's more focused on the talents than the low wage type of labor. And fifthly, that the reinventing of the government that is taking place, okay? I would again focus on the last point you mentioned, the private sectors may be represented by the Chamber of Commerce or professional bodies to focus more onto the research. I would recommend the attendance here to look at your book. It's available online, I believe, on Amazon or I don't know where. Yeah.
Go to the publisher's website, you'll get the best deal.
Okay.
Guildfest.co.uk, okay?
So it's available. My comments, which could be just to close up this session, is that I believe there are two issues we need to focus on a separate session, maybe with you or with other presenters, but I didn't have the chance to discuss and we don't have the time for them. But anyway, the two comments I have is that the governments here, as well as in the whole world, encouraged a lot the entrepreneurship. And I think, in my personal opinion, that's a crime actually, okay, in certain aspect of it. Because instead of creating jobs, we just encourage all those young people without any experience to go and open businesses and compete and failure. And that is a big hole for the government support that's going into that direction. The second comment I have is about actually the status quo that is going on for the past 50 years. There is a system which is automatically balanced between the income of the people, their pay scale, the prices in the market, you know, the businesses, how they run, their operating costs, and this is a complete change. I think I don't have a solution, but something needs to be done to fix this, to come up with a new balance. We can't just leave it to the people on themselves to do, and the government, they do something else. A more open discussion or research type of discussions, or I mean, a formal researches needs to be done in that regard. Anyway, thanks to Majlis Khonji again, and always for excellent, or giving us the opportunities for such excellent presentations and sessions. And I would like to thank everybody who attended and participated. Thank you very much.
If I may, just by way of conclusion, also extend my sincere thanks to Majlis Al-Khonji. I think this was a very valuable and enjoyable opportunity. And I have to tell all of you who participated, who asked questions, I am extremely impressed. If this is how discussions are had in Oman, then Oman has a lot to be proud of and a bright future to look forward to. I think this is extremely encouraging. You are asking the right questions, and this is how change begins. I'm very honored to have been part of this company today, and anything I can do to be of assistance, continue the conversation, please don't hesitate. My contacts, the book details, anything you can get from the organizer or through Amir or through me, and they can also tell you how to get in touch with me. I wish you a nice rest of the day, and I wish you all the best for the future. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jarmo, for this comprehensive session. Thank you, Your Excellency Khalil Al-Khonji. Thank you, Mr. Amir, for moderating this session, and thank you, our guest, for the participation. In our next session, we will continue our series of talks on economics. We have Professor Ayn Spires, who will talk about economics in Oman for C executives. Until we see you next week, stay safe and goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rian.